The aroma of fresh-baked bread filled the mess hall at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on a humid August morning in 1944, as German prisoner of war Feldwebel Wilhelm Kramer received a slice of white bread that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bread was soft, made from genuine wheat flour, and spread with real butter. Luxuries that his family in Hamburg had not tasted since 1942, when ersatz bread made from sawdust, potato peels, and barley became the standard ration for German civilians. Kramer had been captured during the Allied breakout from Normandy after fighting through years of declining German rations that reflected the systematic collapse of the Reich's food supply system. His wife's last letter described bread so dark and bitter that their children refused to eat it, forcing her to mix it with water to create a gruel that provided minimal nutrition for growing bodies already weakened by malnutrition. What Kramer experienced in American captivity would challenge every assumption he held about enemy character and democratic values. Fresh bread daily, made from real wheat flour, was not a special treat but standard procedure in American POW camps. While German civilians queued for hours to receive bread rations that were 50% sawdust and 30% turnip flour, German prisoners in America received bakery-quality bread that exceeded what German officers had enjoyed during peacetime. The psychological impact was devastating and inescapable. Enemy prisoners were eating better than free German citizens, creating moral complexity that would fundamentally alter Kramer's understanding of the war he had been fighting and the nation he had sworn to defend. If you want to discover more incredible stories of how American abundance created profound moral dilemmas even in wartime captivity, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Feldwebel Wilhelm Kramer's last taste of genuine bread in Germany had been Christmas 1942, when his wife Margarete had saved precious white flour for weeks to bake a small loaf that fed their family for one precious day. By 1943, German bread had become a mockery of its former self, a gray, dense mixture of sawdust, ground acorns, potato peels, and whatever grain could be salvaged from bombed storage facilities. The systematic deterioration of German bread quality reflected broader collapse in agricultural production and food distribution that Allied strategic bombing had deliberately targeted. Rail networks carrying grain were destroyed, flour mills were bombed, and storage facilities were eliminated through precision attacks that reduced German food security to desperate improvisation using whatever materials could sustain human life. Technical analysis of German bread composition by 1944 revealed ingredients that would have been considered inedible during peacetime. Sawdust comprised 40% of typical bread rations, cellulose from wood pulp provided bulk, and chemical additives attempted to create texture that resembled genuine baked goods. The resulting product was barely digestible and provided minimal nutritional value for civilian populations already weakened by systematic food shortages. Personal correspondence from German families painted increasingly desperate pictures of bread quality that reflected homeland conditions more accurately than official propaganda about civilian resilience. Kramer's wife described bread so bitter that children cried when forced to eat it, while elderly relatives suffered digestive problems from cellulose additives that human stomachs couldn't process effectively. The economic mathematics of German bread production revealed systematic failure in resource allocation that prioritized military requirements over civilian nutrition. Grain allocation favored military rations and livestock feed for meat production, while civilian bread manufacturers received whatever materials remained after strategic requirements were satisfied through administrative rationing systems. Cultural significance of bread in German society made its systematic degradation particularly demoralizing for civilian populations who had considered quality bakery products fundamental elements of national identity and family tradition. Bread-making skills passed down through generations became useless when genuine ingredients were unavailable through any legal channels or economic arrangements. Medical consequences of ersatz bread consumption included systematic malnutrition among German civilians who couldn't extract adequate nutrition from substitute ingredients that provided calories without essential vitamins, minerals, or digestible proteins necessary for human health maintenance under wartime stress conditions. International comparison revealed German bread quality declining relative to occupied territories, where local agricultural production sometimes maintained better nutrition standards than German civilians received through official rationing systems that prioritized military requirements over domestic welfare considerations. The psychological impact on German soldiers reflected growing awareness that their families were suffering more severely than enemy civilians, creating moral conflicts between military duty and family responsibility that undermined combat effectiveness through worry about homeland conditions that military victory might not improve if agricultural systems had collapsed beyond recovery. Black market activities flourished around genuine bread ingredients, creating underground economy that operated despite severe legal penalties for food speculation. Families traded valuable possessions for real flour, while criminal networks profited from civilian desperation that official rationing systems couldn't satisfy through legitimate channels. The bread shortage became symbol of systematic failure in German resource management that had sacrificed civilian welfare for military objectives that were proving unattainable against enemies who seemed to possess unlimited food resources, while German families faced systematic starvation that individual courage couldn't remedy through traditional methods. The bakery operations at Camp Shelby produced 15,000 loaves of fresh bread daily, using genuine wheat flour, real yeast, and quality ingredients that German prisoners hadn't seen since before the war began. American abundance applied to prisoner welfare exceeded Geneva Convention requirements through systematic attention to nutrition that treated enemy soldiers with dignity that their own government had been unable to provide for German civilians. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, the camp's chief baker, whose Polish-American family had fled German occupation in 1919, supervised bread production that maintained commercial bakery standards despite serving enemy prisoners. Fresh yeast arrived weekly from American suppliers, while white flour flowed continuously from Midwest wheat farms operating without rationing restrictions that German agriculture had experienced since 1942. Quality control procedures ensured consistent bread texture, taste, and nutritional value across thousands of daily servings through systematic baking methods that American commercial bakeries had developed for civilian markets. Statistical sampling verified ingredient proportions. Standardized mixing procedures maintained consistency, and systematic timing produced reliable results despite massive production volumes. The ingredient quality amazed German prisoners who examined American bread composition through professional knowledge gained from pre-war civilian occupations. Wheat flour content was 100% genuine grain without substitute materials. Yeast cultures were fresh rather than synthetic alternatives, and salt, sugar, and shortening met commercial standards that German bakeries had abandoned when rationing eliminated access to quality ingredients. Economic implications became apparent as prisoners observed American casual consumption of bread without rationing consciousness that German civilians had developed through years of scarcity. Workers discarded partially eaten loaves that would have fed German families for days, while kitchen staff prepared fresh batches without concern for waste prevention that German households practiced as survival necessity. Nutritional analysis revealed American bread providing complete protein combinations, essential vitamins, and digestible carbohydrates that ersatz German bread couldn't supply through substitute ingredients. Medical examinations documented systematic malnutrition among German prisoners that reflected homeland conditions rather than combat hardships, while American feeding gradually restored health through adequate nutrition. Cultural differences in bread preparation reflected systematic advantages that extended beyond agricultural production to encompass social values about individual dignity and community responsibility. American emphasis on quality, variety, and satisfaction contrasted with German wartime priorities that emphasized survival efficiency over dietary pleasure or personal preferences. The workforce supporting bread production included civilian contractors whose casual abundance contradicted German assumptions about American civilian sacrifice during wartime. Delivery personnel, equipment maintenance, and supply coordination operated without resource constraints that German food distribution had experienced since Allied bombing intensified throughout occupied territories. International cooperation through prison camp food service demonstrated American ability to maintain humanitarian standards while conducting global warfare across multiple theaters simultaneously. Enemy prisoners received nutrition that exceeded minimum legal requirements through systematic abundance that democratic capitalism had enabled, despite wartime resource demands. Personal transformation began among German prisoners, who realized that enemy treatment provided better nutrition than their families received as free German citizens. The psychological complexity created cognitive dissonance between loyalty to homeland and gratitude for humane treatment that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, national character, and moral obligations that military service had traditionally emphasized. The bread that challenged beliefs was more than food. It was evidence of systematic advantages in agricultural production, food distribution, and social organization that democratic society had achieved through competitive efficiency rather than administrative control that German tradition had emphasized throughout cultural development. The weekly correspondence between Camp Shelby and Germany created psychological torment for prisoners who struggled to describe their treatment without causing additional pain to families already suffering from systematic food shortages. Wilhelm Kramer's letters became exercises in careful omission, as he couldn't bring himself to mention fresh bread while reading about his children's hunger. Margaret Kramer's letters described bread so inedible that her 8-year-old daughter Anna had lost 12 pounds despite her mother's desperate attempts to make ersatz bread palatable through whatever flavoring could be obtained. "The children ask when real bread will return," she wrote in coded language that avoided military censorship. "I tell them patience brings rewards, but my hope grows thin as winter approaches." The psychological burden of abundance versus family starvation created moral crises that affected prisoner behavior, camp discipline, and mental health throughout the German POW population. Men who had been trained to endure hardship for national victory now faced reality that their capture had improved their living conditions, while their families suffered consequences of the war they had been fighting. Personal coping mechanisms included systematic bread refusal among prisoners who attempted to share family suffering through symbolic solidarity, though American medical staff intervened when such behavior threatened individual health. Self-imposed rationing, careful consumption, and attempted bread preservation for impossible shipment home reflected desperate attempts to reconcile abundance with family suffering. The camp's chaplain services, conducted by various religious leaders, addressed theological questions about accepting enemy charity, while family members suffered from food shortages beyond their control. Moral discussions about duty, survival, and divine providence helped prisoners develop frameworks for understanding complex circumstances that traditional military training had never addressed. Dr. Heinrich Weber, a captured German physician, documented psychological effects of abundance guilt among prisoners who experienced survivor remorse, complicated by knowledge that their survival depended on enemies their families had been taught to hate. Depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems increased as the contrast between prisoner treatment and family suffering became more apparent through regular correspondence. Educational programs implemented by American authorities included discussions about agricultural production, food distribution systems, and social policies that maintained civilian nutrition despite global warfare. These lessons revealed systematic approaches to resource allocation that prioritized civilian welfare alongside military requirements, contrasting sharply with German policies that had sacrificed civilian nutrition for military objectives. Work assignments in camp kitchens allowed prisoners to participate in bread production that provided psychological relief through constructive activity while creating complex emotions about contributing to abundance that their families couldn't access. German soldiers who had fought to defend their homeland now helped bake bread that exceeded their families' nutrition while serving as prisoners of war. Medical treatment addressed not just physical malnutrition, but psychological trauma associated with family separation, civilian suffering, and moral conflict between gratitude for humane treatment and loyalty to suffering families. Therapeutic interventions included group discussions about survivor responsibility and individual counseling that helped prisoners process complex emotional responses. The correspondence regulations were modified to allow greater freedom in describing prisoner treatment as American authorities recognized that transparency about camp conditions might provide hope to German families while demonstrating democratic values to enemy populations who had been taught to expect brutality from Allied forces. The letters that carried bitter truth became documentation of systematic failure in German resource allocation that had created civilian starvation, while American abundance enabled humanitarian treatment even for enemy prisoners who ate fresh bread daily, while their children survived on sawdust substitutes. October 1944. The psychological weight of fresh bread became unbearable for German prisoners who had gained average weight of 18 pounds during American captivity, while receiving letters describing family members who had lost 25 pounds or more due to systematic food shortages. The moral complexity created by daily bread abundance while German children ate sawdust created existential crises that challenged fundamental beliefs about duty, sacrifice, and national loyalty. The camp's psychiatric services, supervised by Major Sarah Goldman, whose medical training had included trauma research, treated increasing numbers of German prisoners suffering from abundance syndrome, psychological distress caused by receiving better treatment than their families while being held by enemies their propaganda had portrayed as brutal oppressors. Personal rituals developed among prisoners included morning bread ceremonies, where men would hold fresh slices while silently dedicating their meal to suffering family members, attempting to create spiritual connection across impossible distances. Some prisoners attempted to eat only bread crusts while saving the soft interior, though camp regulations prevented food hoarding for sanitary and security reasons. The educational programs expanded to include detailed comparisons between American and German agricultural systems, revealing systematic advantages in food production that democratic society had achieved through competitive farming, technological innovation, and resource allocation that prioritized civilian welfare alongside military requirements. These lessons challenged German assumptions about agricultural efficiency and social organization. Work therapy and camp bakeries provided psychological relief for prisoners who found purpose in bread production, while processing complex emotions about abundance their families couldn't access. German soldiers who had defended their homeland now helped produce bread that exceeded their family nutrition, creating therapeutic value through constructive activity despite emotional complexity. Religious counseling addressed theological questions about divine justice that would provide enemy prisoners with better nutrition than faithful German families who supported the war effort through personal sacrifice. Interfaith discussions about providence, suffering, and moral responsibility helped prisoners develop frameworks for understanding circumstances that traditional military chaplaincy had never addressed. The correspondence modifications allowed prisoners to describe their treatment more openly, as American authorities recognized that transparency about camp conditions might provide hope to German families, while demonstrating democratic humanitarian values to enemy populations who had been conditioned to expect brutality from Allied forces. Medical research conducted with prisoner volunteers included nutritional studies comparing German ersatz bread with American standard bread, documenting systematic health improvements among prisoners who received adequate nutrition for the first time in years. These studies would contribute to post-war understanding of malnutrition effects and recovery procedures. Personal transformation among prisoners included gradual acceptance that American treatment reflected systematic advantages in social organization rather than temporary wartime allocation. Democratic abundance had enabled humanitarian treatment that exceeded minimum legal requirements through competitive economy that produced surplus resources rather than scarcity requiring careful conservation. The guilt that consumed dignity was slowly transformed through understanding that individual prisoners bore no responsibility for strategic decisions that had created civilian suffering, while American humanitarian values demonstrated systematic advantages of democratic society over authoritarian systems that had sacrificed civilian welfare for military objectives. Mental health treatment included group therapy sessions where prisoners processed survivor guilt, family separation trauma, and cognitive dissonance between enemy generosity and national loyalty. Professional counseling helped develop coping mechanisms that enabled psychological survival without compromising personal integrity or family devotion that military service had emphasized. The fresh bread had become symbol of systematic failure in German resource allocation, while demonstrating American values that would influence prisoner attitudes toward post-war reconstruction and international cooperation. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Day arrived at Camp Shelby with complex emotions as German prisoners who had consumed fresh bread daily for months prepared to return to a homeland where genuine bread remained unavailable for civilian populations. The final statistics were devastating. German prisoners in American camps had better nutrition than 80% of German civilians, including families of the soldiers being repatriated. The repatriation process revealed the full scope of German civilian malnutrition that had occurred while prisoners enjoyed American bread abundance. Medical examinations showed prisoners had gained average weight of 22 pounds during captivity through adequate nutrition, while intelligence reports from occupied Germany described systematic food shortages that exceeded wartime conditions in prisoner camps. Wilhelm Kramer's reunion with his family exposed the moral complexity through physical evidence that couldn't be rationalized or denied. His healthy appearance contrasted sharply with his wife's malnourished condition and his children's obvious signs of prolonged hunger, creating personal reckoning with reality that enemy treatment had exceeded homeland support for civilian welfare during the war's critical phases. The psychological transformation among German prisoners included comprehensive reassessment of American values, democratic governance, and humanitarian principles that had enabled systematic abundance even for enemy soldiers, while German authorities had failed to maintain adequate civilian nutrition despite total control over resource allocation and strategic planning. Economic lessons learned through prisoner experience included understanding of American agricultural abundance, food distribution networks, and social policies that maintained civilian welfare during wartime. These insights would influence German post-war reconstruction toward democratic governance and competitive economics rather than centralized planning that had sacrificed civilian needs for military objectives. Personal relationships developed between prisoners and American personnel created lasting bonds that transcended wartime animosity through shared human experiences around food preparation, cultural exchange, and mutual respect. Former enemies became advocates for international cooperation based on humanitarian values rather than military dominance or ideological supremacy. Educational impact extended beyond individual prisoners to influence families and communities through detailed descriptions of American food abundance, democratic participation, and social organization that prioritized civilian welfare alongside military objectives. These testimonies challenged Nazi ideology while providing models for post-war reconstruction and social development. Medical documentation revealed systematic health improvements among German prisoners that reflected not just adequate nutrition, but comprehensive health care that exceeded German civilian medical services during wartime. American investment in prisoner welfare demonstrated values that prioritized human dignity over revenge or strategic advantage through humanitarian competition. International implications included demonstration of American humanitarian values that would influence post-war relationships with former enemies. Generous treatment of prisoners created goodwill that facilitated democratic reconstruction while establishing American leadership through moral example rather than military occupation alone. The workforce skills acquired through camp bakery operations prepared German prisoners for post-war civilian employment through technical training in food production, quality control, and systematic organization. These practical abilities would contribute to German economic recovery while maintaining appreciation for American democratic methods and humanitarian values. Personal testimony from returning prisoners influenced German civilian understanding of American society, democratic governance, and systematic abundance that had enabled humanitarian treatment of enemies, while German civilians had faced systematic deprivation. These accounts contributed to German acceptance of democratic occupation policies and reconstruction programs. If this profound story of how daily bread revealed the moral complexity of warfare and the power of humanitarian values inspired you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales that show how basic human dignity transcends even the darkest conflicts. The fresh bread had represented more than nutrition. It had been evidence of systematic advantages that democratic societies possessed through humanitarian values that extended even to enemy prisoners, while demonstrating the failure of authoritarian systems to provide for their own civilians.